we moments ago discovered that we have no moderator, so I'm leaping into the fray, even though I have no idea what's going on here.
Fit right in.
Interesting topic that we're talking about today, and let's go around the table and just introduce ourselves.
I'm Doug Beeson. My formal training was as a physicist, and I was at Los Alamos, both as a researcher in my dissertation there, and ended up as an associate lab director. And I've written 15 books, just turned in one last week with Kevin Anderson, who has written some stuff, and finishing up one with Ben Boba.
My name's Courtney Willis. I was a teacher all my life. For the first 1,000 years, I was a real teacher and taught high school physics and chemistry. For the last 1,000 years, I've been in the physics department up in northern Colorado. But even while I was up there, I would teach the physics classes, but I also worked with the kids who were going to be teachers because I had been one for a long time.
My name is Kachun Yu, and I'm an astronomer at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So I have a PhD in astrophysics, and I've done a lot of educational and outreach work, including educational research at the Denver Museum.
I'm the moderator. No, nothing. Well, actually, I'm Mike Carroll here. I began as an astronomical artist back when dinosaurs ruled the earth. Began science writing about 10 years into that career. By now I'm 27 books out, 25 of which are nonfiction, mostly space science, and 2 novels, another one on.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Leslie Smith. I work at CU Boulder. I'm a physicist. I actually work, though, in the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Science. In the past, I did do some teaching. I'm currently still active in doing a lot of mentoring programs for students, and I'm also a science fiction writer.
And what have you written?
The Quantum Cop is the book I'm emphasizing this weekend.
Cool. All right. Well, the name of this panel is The Marching Morons. Is scientific illiteracy growing? I think the implication and the reason we're all here is that maybe we have the fear that it is. And so maybe what we should do is hit that with a yes or no answer, and then a brief reason for why you gave that answer. Do you want to start?
I'm going to go out on a limb. I think you guys are all going to disagree with me, but I think Americans are not becoming more scientifically illiterate. So I think there's a lot more information out there, and we have access to it. I would say a skill, at least Americans maybe need to develop a little more, is critical thinking. So we get a lot of good information, and we also get some not so good information, so we need to be able to discern between those.
Great. Kachun?
So I actually agree with Leslie, and I'll dive more into the reasons why in our panel discussion. But if you, many of you are probably familiar with the news about how American students perform in science and math and other subjects relative to their peers in other countries. And what is really interesting is that if you look at elementary school kids, they actually do well compared to their counterparts, like the K-5 students. And it's only when you get to high school that student performance is pretty mediocre. Now, what is also really interesting is that when you compare adult performance, and of course, there are things like climate or evolution where those topics have made the news just because of how adults in the U.S. have answered. But it turns out that adults perform better than most adults in comparative or comparable countries, including almost all of Western Europe. So basically all the European Union, and Japan and South Korea. So in many ways, we are holding our own. I mean, it's still not great, but I agree with Leslie and say that we have not necessarily gotten a lot worse.
Well, I'm going to have to agree with our last two speakers. I started teaching in January of 1966. And so I've got kind of a broad background of things to compare with and stuff. And yesterday in this room, some of you were here, I gave a test that showed very basic science test, but it was interesting because it had not only how Americans did on it, but it also had how European Union, Canada, Russia, Malaysia, Japan, and you know, America wasn't on the bottom. It was actually towards the top. Canadians seem to beat us, but.
Well, I was a contrarian the last panel, and I think I'm going to do that again, but I'm willing to be persuaded. And I'm basing this on two conflicting pieces of data that I've been exposed to. The first was when I was at Los Alamos. Oh, first of all, I think what we should talk about is what do you mean by scientific literacy, and that is going to be important. But when I was at Los Alamos, and when we tried to hire people onto the laboratory, what we found was a marked declining of qualified individuals, PhDs. Normally we're looking to hire a lot of postdocs that were from America. And we had a lot from Europe, more from China that applied to the laboratory, and that increased every year. The conflicting part of the data, though, was that when we did try to go out to the top tier schools, Princeton, the Caltechs, to bring in people, basically the second we identified somebody, Google would come in and offer them $100,000 more. So just because we didn't get the people didn't mean that. But anyway, that's where I'm.
Okay, that's interesting. And I forgot that I'm also a panel member, so I'll throw in here too. I happen to also work with an interesting part of the community, the fairly conservative religious folks. I teach at a hub for homeschoolers 1 day a week. And they've been painted with a fairly wide brush that says that they all believe in a 6,000-year-old Earth and they're skeptical about climate change. But I find that in the science class that I teach, people are very open to new ideas. I think that we need to look for opportunities to communicate about these things and not worry too much about the preconceptions we have about people who hold various opinions. Science is a great tool. So the question is how we put that out there. What is scientific literacy? You want to hit that for us?
Start.
Okay, great.
So John Miller, he's a researcher at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and he has been studying scientific literacy in the United States for decades. You can find papers of his back into the 80s. And his definition of what he calls civic scientific literacy is basically understanding enough science that you can make an informed decision about something involving policy. So in our society, we are faced with decisions that politicians have to make, that we as a voter have to make about things that will affect us. And so his definition includes not only understanding just some very basic facts about what a molecule is or what is DNA, but also some understanding of the processes of science. And he basically says, you need enough to be able to basically go and read the New York Times science section, or to be able to watch an episode of Nova and not be totally confused. And also, you should also have enough that if something new comes along, like stem cells or nanotechnology, you can use your prior knowledge and use that to educate yourself about this new topic. Now, it does not mean that you have to be an expert on these topics. We're not asking for people to have the same amount of awareness or literacy as practicing scientists, but it's just enough to be able to make an informed decision in your everyday life. So the one thing that John Miller has found is he started looking at adult scientific literacy starting about 1988, and at that time he had created a test of these questions asking people if they were understood these very basic concepts. And in 1988, 1990, about 10% of the adult population could be considered scientifically literate. And in 2008, the numbers had gone up to about 30%. And then what's interesting is that in the latest press release that came out just this summer from him, the numbers actually haven't gone up, so they've kind of plateaued at about 30%.
Do they attribute that to anything specific?
Well, there's a lot of speculation. John Miller, he has done some modeling of the audiences that he uses in the surveys, and so the two biggest factors that contribute to this so-called civic literacy is whether you have a bachelor's degree or not. So people who, the more schooling that you have, the more chances are that you've taken a science course. And in the United States, if you've gone to college in the US, you usually are required to take at least one, if not several science courses. And then next is so the bachelor's degree, but also the total number of courses. So the more courses you take, the greater the chance that you will be scientifically literate. And the other really interesting finding, and remember what I said earlier in my opening statement that US adults actually compare well with their peers internationally. So if you look at the European Union, the US actually does better for adults than everyone else except for Sweden, based on a survey from, I think, roughly about the same time, about 6 or 7 years ago. And part of this Miller attributes to the fact that we do have a requirement in college to take science classes, whereas in most European countries, you're really focused on your degree, so you don't take classes beyond what you're trying to study for. So that's part of it. And then but not everyone goes to college, and so the other factor that John Falk and Lynn Dierke, who are researchers at the University of Oregon, they study informal or non-formal education, so education outside of the school. They think it has to do with the fact that, we spend, the average American spends about 5% of their waking hours in formal education. So if you look at a person who lives to be 72, 76 years old, and they spend how many hours a day from K through 12, and then they have a 4-year college degree, that's only 5% of their waking hours. And so there's 95% of their time that they're spending doing everything else, and it could be going to museums, it could be being involved in 4-H, it could be involved in your gardening club, or your stargazing, or watching Nova. And so there's evidence to suggest that it's our activities outside of school that has kept us from performing really badly on these science literacy.
And those numbers can be deceiving because, I don't know about you guys, but I did a lot of time sleeping in college, so.
Yeah, this is very intriguing, and it kind of explains something that, well, Courtney had pointed out. It isn't kind of suspicious that everybody on the panel is a physicist or else has a physics background. And for those of you who don't know this subculture of physics, versus, you know, the rest of technology and science, not only do they think that they're smarter,
It's the only pure science.
they are, but I had an engineer friend ask me once, why is it that physicists never just memorize the equations? Why is it that you guys want to dive down, derive everything from the bottom? Well, you know, that's part of our nature. Because what he was getting at, and this is what's the intriguing part, is the point that my engineer friend was pointing out was that the foundation or the base every year seems to be growing as far as the technological knowledge. And if you're a mechanical engineer or chemical engineer, you don't have to understand, you know, 2,000 years of every single thing that has gone on. But what you can do is you can expand outward, if that makes sense. And I think we see that a lot in the public today, where the people may not be scientifically literate in the sense of being able to go back and say, oh, Copernicus did this, and then they did, you know, I mean, that, you know, whatever, then they used Newtonian physics, because it doesn't matter, because really what they're starting with is, okay, here are the electronics I'm going to build up. And so with the amount of knowledge that's available today, it makes sense then that the scientific literacy. So I just
Agreed with everyone.
I think another thing that Katrin was talking about was there's a lot of informal science education that goes on outside of high school and college. You know, we're at a science fiction convention, and I know we have a lot of people who dress up funny and stuff. My daughter is one of them when she comes, but you know, the scientific literacy of people at a science fiction convention like this, I think is really quite high.
Yeah.
You know, and you can get into a discussion of all sorts of things, you know, and I've gotten into discussions on physics on certain areas that people who aren't in physics, but they seem to know more than I do on that because of their informal study and stuff like that. So I think that's one of the other things. We have a lot of opportunities to do science-related things
Yes.
as adults.
Yeah, and a lot of sources of information. In fact, Leslie, do you want to talk a little about where you think people are going to find out about this?
You can get science info anywhere.
Right.
That's both the blessing and a curse, right?
Yes.
You can get the email from your aunt who says, look at this. Or you can get it on Facebook, or it's all over the internet, of course. And of course, the trick is you want to vet your sources a little bit. So if you're at a like Scientific American website, then that data is probably a little more reliable than your aunt's email, right?
Right.
So I think there's all kinds of
Who
opportunities.
your aunt is.
That is a great point.
That's true, yes.
Great point.
But if you are
Sorry,
suspicious.
if you're talking about a science fiction movie on Facebook, somebody's cousin is a scientist.
Right.
And a lot of people, I mean, I've learned a lot that way. Different chat rooms, different social media platforms, and I know a lot of my friends have.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And if you want to check something on the internet that you're not sure about, go to a .org or .edu or .gov site rather than .com. And those are heavily vetted. For my kids, I teach them that they can look at Wikipedia, but only to direct them to the sources on the bottom, which are one of those. So yeah, I think the filter we use is very important on that.
I think,
YouTube is, oh, sorry.
There was a worry, for people who grew up in the 70s and 80s. And I remember watching Cosmos for the first time, and I was completely blown away. And I was, that really helped shape me and directed more what I wanted to be. And Cosmos was groundbreaking, not only for the type of science that it showcased, but for how popular it was. I mean, it was one of the most popular shows worldwide. And then in the 90s, you had Bill Nye, who was able to reach another younger audience. And there have been critics that have bemoaned the state of television in the sense that there really isn't anything sort of culturally shattering like Cosmos did when it came out in the late 70s.
There's a Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, there's but I've also heard the counter argument that there's actually a huge amount of science video programming on the internet. That some of the biggest channels, I mean, when they drop a new episode, they are literally seeing tens of millions of people coming out to watch these new episodes. And so, and unfortunately, those type of programs are not as easily compared, or you can't get the stats as easily, or in the same way as regular TV. But instead of going to traditional television programming, it seems like the audience is still there, but they've migrated to other forms. So that's important to recognize.
Yeah. This is just one situation, but since you talked about Big Bang Theory and stuff like that, it was kind of interesting when Big Bang Theory first came out, because I was getting from lots of physicists, Courtney, you have to see this. This is great. This is fun. And my wife, who is not in science by any means or anything, she was getting from lots of her people, you've got to watch this. This is great and stuff. And they were talking about the cons and all that kind of stuff that they're used to. And so we were getting it from two different directions, that we needed to start watching this stupid Big Bang Theory. And so we've continued now. But I just thought it was interesting that we came across something like that from two different directions. And even something like that does have some real science involved.
Right.
Well, plus all the equations that you see have all been vetted by the Caltech physics department.
Yeah. Yeah.
They do have an advisor on staff.
That's great. Well, there you go. All right.
So the conclusion is there's lots of sources for info. Yay.
Right. Yeah, but be careful how you use them. Yes. Maybe it's a good time to open it up for.
Well, I've got an example though and maybe this is why I was pessimistic at the beginning of this. That's because when I was at Los Alamos, we used to work a lot with the government. I don't know if anybody here is in the government. I used to be, once too. But the example that I saw was one of marching morons in that, in the following. If you have a corporation, for example, that is going to be very successful, Google or Apple or whatever it is, typically, both at the top and at the bottom, they have a way to move people out. At the top, that is, the low performers, usually that's anywhere from 3 to 5%, are moved out per year because of performance. And the top percent, believe it or not, they have 3 to 5% move out. Not because they're low performers, but either because of problems with policy, or because they find better jobs. So you always have this influx in these technology companies. Switch to the government, what happens is you still lose the 3 to 5% per year, and that's people coming in, for political appointments or else going out because of administration changes. But at the bottom, you have near zero churning. And so what's happening is that the low performers are growing all the time. So as a whole, and that's what Core Brew's marching morons was. So as a whole, if you have an organization that's going to be making technological decisions for the nation, look at what you got.
Yeah. All right. Interesting. Let's open it to questions. And I'm sorry.
I just, the first question, I saw go on.
I just wanted to go on with your comment about Big Bang Theory. I don't know if you ever noticed, but in The Simpsons, whenever they're writing stuff on the chalkboard, it's a real equation, and they actually go to people and say what kind of an equation. And evidently, usually there's some kind of a joke in the equation. And I'm not enough of a mathematician to follow it, but I thought that it was very interesting that they're sneaking that science in.
Yeah.
To add to that, I read an entire book about the fact that some mathematicians have been part of the writers of The Simpsons.
Yes, they are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so they will do all those weird in math and science shows.
Mathematicians gotta make money somehow.
Yes.
Well, I consider myself fairly scientific literate, but when it comes to like, are GMOs a good thing or a bad thing, I really can't, because there's so much shouting on both sides. Yeah.
There is a lot of noise, yeah.
Right.
And I think that's part of the problem that we all suffer. How do you filter this stuff out? And so again, I think you have to look at the sources and just,
Except I don't know if I even trust, I mean, I have some mistrust of the government, so.
sure.
And they seem to say like, oh, it's okay, and I'm going, yeah, you said that about a lot of things that weren't, so.
Yeah, right. It's difficult. Any thoughts?
Knowing if the source is reliable is always an issue.
Yeah.
Basically, the GMO situation is large enough that there could be truth on both sides.
Right.
And as long as you're only looking at one side, you're going to be living on half the picture.
Right. One other thing to watch for is who is funding it or what agenda the website has.
Follow the money.
Yeah.
Follow the money.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Even in journalism, we try to write objectively, but every journalist, whether they're with NPR or not, has a bias, a worldview. And the best journalism rises above that, but there's always going to be that, and it's just informative. It helps us to know what the perspective is of who's writing. Just use that as a good filter.
Yeah, so it's sort of related to the controversial topics. There's been research that says that the more people know about a topic, the more polarized they are, at least on the controversial ones like GMOs and climate change and so forth. So do any of the panelists have ideas on why that would be the case?
Yeah, I do. I'm going to cite someone else again, since that's what I'm doing. But Dan Kahane, who is a researcher at the Yale School of Law, he and a few other people have done some great work looking at how people understand controversial issues. So most of you are probably aware of the fact that there's a huge fraction of the American public that think that humans lived at the same time as dinosaurs, or they are vehemently against the idea that humans can be responsible for climate change. And as you say, if you actually introduce more information that says, no, this is, we think climate change is happening, and it's caused by human activity, those people become more and more entrenched in their position. So providing more information actually does more harm than good. But what Kahane has found, and I've seen him talk, and I've actually talked to him myself, is that for controversial issues like this, what you're dealing with is not just information that you're providing to someone, but you, in some ways, by providing that information, you're attacking their identity. So their identity, what their values are, what groups that they would like to associate themselves with. And so you can think of it in terms of all these different cultural norms that they identify with. And if they have a worldview, that's a great term that you brought up, Mike, that says that we're all that says that it's good to be very individualistic, and that everyone should try and strive for whatever they can achieve. And now you're providing information that says that it's people like you that are ruining the planet, and of course they will immediately kind of retrench, and because this is only information that you're providing them, whereas you're going up against how they define themselves and which other groups, what other in-groups that they want to be in. And so what he suggests is that you try to reframe the issue by determining what that person's values are. So if that person values individualistic behavior, then you have to come up with a way to reframe it that doesn't devalue or doesn't attack him for his preference. And so he thinks that if you frame it in a way that talks about how entrepreneurs can come up with solutions, or that there are ways in which geoengineering can help solve these problems, people become more receptive. So it's a similar problem, people with evolution, with a lot of different topics. Another really interesting work was Kahane found that depending on how you phrase the question, people who would normally appear like they don't know anything about evolution and they're just young Earth creationists, they can actually reveal that they know quite a lot. So if you just ask them, did dinosaurs walk with human beings? They'll say yes. But then if you rephrase it and say, what do the scientists believe happened? They'll actually be able to answer that question correctly. They'll be able to say, the scientists believe this about evolution, and that's because of just how the phrasing goes. And so they're not unaware, they're not stupid about what the other side says, but it's just that because of the values that they have and their in-group, it's better for them to have this particular belief about evolution, but they are still aware of what the other side is saying.
And to follow up on that, even things that appear to be blatantly clear to people, well, like evolution, climate change, like the 4 fundamental forces, like the speed of light, you can become so entrenched in that, believing that that is true, is that you'll actually miss any data to the contrary of that. And we see that right now with the 4 fundamental forces. Are there really 5 fundamental forces, or is there this thing called negative energy? Basically, most of the scientific community thinks that there is negative energy, negative mass, but there is a big portion of the scientific community that says, no, we think there's a 5th force that's out there. And the same thing with things like supersymmetry. And we see that all the time, or even the speed of light. Is it invariant? Well, the very nature, that defines the very nature of the universe. And is it invariant? And that goes back to what is time, and is time really an intrinsic part of the universe? And there are theories going on now that it's not. So unless, what I'm trying to say is that unless you are open to even question what you think is absolutely true, then you're never going to be able to make that next branch.
Right.
That's good.
Yeah, right. Wow.
It's tough.
With so many breakthroughs in science that have hit the news and people are aware of it, like curiosity on Mars, like we can clone animals, humans can have 3 parents. All of that is, for lack of a better word, sexy.
Yeah.
So do you think that is attracting more people to understand science?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it is. What do you guys think?
Sure.
Sure.
But beyond that, how do we combat that, or should we? Or should we take advantage of it?
I'm all for sexy science.
How many of you saw when the Curiosity rover landed on Mars, there was the famous 7 minutes of terror. How many of you saw that video?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when I saw that, I thought that was the most absolutely amazing thing, and I thought, you should be showing this to all the kids in school, because this shows you how amazing engineers can be to even think of this, incredibly complicated process to land this 1-ton, 2-ton rover on Mars. And I mean, when we're talking about being sexy is a video like that, I say yes.
You
Have one of those.
bet, you bet.
And along with that is something like The Martian. When you've got Matt Damon in a movie.
Even the scientists,
There it is, yeah, right.
even the scientists are willing to forgive him forgive the author the windstorm.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Okay, so how then, since we've got a government basically, and you were talking about the bottom 3%, 3%, and Neil deGrasse Tyson himself said, we've got a whole, the Congress that's basically all lawyers. So you've got a certain kind of zero-sum idea of how everything needs to be decided, and this might be a cultural influence on us. So how do we get more scientists into government?
Vote for them?
Scientists are smart enough to not want to be part of it.
Well, that's a problem.
That's the issue, yeah, it is a problem.
Well, I think there's also a problem with how journalists, sometimes when they don't know how to talk about something, they sort of reduce it to money. They
Yes.
say a large hadron collider takes, so many hundreds of millions of dollars to build, and it loses, some of the wonder of what does this thing actually do, what might it tell us about, our own planet and how we should live on it.
Yes.
And I think that's a problem.
That's the essence of good science writing, is to get the data across, but retain that wonder of, of the universe around us and what we're looking into. Yes.
I'd like to get back to the scientific literacy thing where there are two, I see as kind of like two components. There's knowledge, which goes into what beliefs people have, but there's also this critical thinking part. And I'm curious as to what the panelists think, how that has changed, if at all, over time in the experience that you've had in your life so far. And focus on the critical, person being able to analyze and look at what the data says. Is that saying something or not? Should I accept that data or not versus other data? It's that type of thing. How do you think that has evolved or changed? And I'm curious if are there any surveys that focus only on that part rather than the knowledge part?
One of the,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the stirring trends that I've seen, I don't know how widespread it is for scientists and engineers to throw out data that they don't believe, either to advance what they had a preconceived notion of what the answer should be, or because of some other agenda. And we see it everywhere from physics to the medical field, where there are ethics cases. And that, to me, is just appalling. But on the other hand, seeing creativity, a new way to solve the answer of a problem that you're trying to get to, is seeing people step back and say, well, what are we really trying to answer? And let me give a quick anecdote. When I was at Los Alamos, one of the groups I ran, the free electron laser people were just spectacular people. The free electron lasers are huge, huge machines. They can be as big as corporate buildings, because you need to accelerate these particle beams, and run them through magnets to be able to get this laser energy out. But what you can do, since that laser wavelength is so finely tuned for a free electron laser, you can just do some spectacular particle physics with this. And what these folks were trying to do was, hey, all we need is another $500 million. But it took a couple of young Turks, basically, to say, wait a minute, what are we really trying to solve? Do we really need to accelerate all these bunches of electrons with this huge, first racetrack free electron laser, or can we do it with just one or two electrons with a tabletop laser? Turns out you can get the same phenomenology And so for, a milkshake and 50 cents, we're able to get the same basic physics result. And it's that type of creativity that we need more of.
And
Stepping back.
one of the things that happened to talk about yesterday is the emphasis, when lots of us went to school, the emphasis was on always getting the right answer, just memorizing the answer, kind of thing. But in the couple of tests that I showed yesterday, the second one was the new GED test, which is, Kim didn't graduate from high school, so she's taken the GED so she can say she has a high school diploma. They've changed the test a great deal from just memorizing everything to analyzing diagrams, looking at various tables, reading something and trying to come up from there. Now, I don't think that it's exceptionally deep reasoning and stuff, but it's not just straight memorization. And I think that's kind of the direction we seem to be moving, that we're looking more at, can we do this kind of stuff rather than, can you name the 9 planets in the solar system? Mother very thoughtfully made jelly sandwiches using no peanut butter because Pluto was a planet when I was a kid.
It still is.
Yeah.
I'm going to make just 2 really quick points. To answer your question, unfortunately, I haven't really looked into how much people have studied critical thinking over the years. I do know that in John Miller's surveys, he does incorporate some aspect of understanding how science works, but I have his survey questions to see what aspect actually covers critical thinking. I know one of the questions does deal with probability in like a very basic sense. So unfortunately, I don't know. But going back to Doug and Courtney's points, I think creativity is really important in science, and unfortunately, if you go through it in many science classes that people take in high school, the creativity is missing from it. And remember what I said, that in the U.S., elementary school kids usually do well. They do miserably in high school, but somehow as adults they turn out to be okay, or at least comparable to their peers in other countries. And so clearly there's still a lot that can be done better at high school and in middle school, because that's usually when kids start taking science classes. I mean, elementary school teachers usually don't have the experience to really teach science. But if you look at I know you taught chemistry, so I'm not besmirching your credibility. But I think a lot of kids, when they take chemistry class, they think science is following the instructions in your chemistry book, and that if you do this, this, and this, you're going to get this result. But that's not what science is. Science is about trying to figure out a solution to a problem, and in order to and the process for getting to that solution is not contained in a book. You have to be extremely creative to be able to think about what approaches that other people have not thought of, what they're not doing in order to tackle this problem. And so there's been a big movement towards STEAM. So instead of just science, technology, engineering, and math, they have the A for art. And I think there's a lot of credence to that methodology, because you really want to engage students creatively and to have them think about, and this is something that all practicing scientists do. I mean, they would be the first ones to tell you that being creative is probably one of the most important attributes to have as a scientist. But you don't get that in a lot of schooling.
Right, and some of the entry portals to complex science involve creative writing and the visual arts, as you say, poetry. So I think it's a multi-front battle. We have time for one more very quick question. Go for it, Chuck.
Years ago, we had brilliant people like Albert Einstein and Vannevar Bush and Johnny von Neumann advising the government on science policy. Do we have anybody of that stature doing it today?
I think we should stay away from politics here today.
Okay, well, how about this?
I think that's an answer
It's okay. Dangerous minefields, those are always fun, but maybe afterwards we'll talk more about that. Let's each take just 1 minute we have 1 minute each to just sum up the state of things today, and whether you're optimistic or pessimistic, give us a little conclusion. Let's start with Leslie.
Boy, I'm gonna have to say optimistic. Look at this great crowd here. We're all scientifically literate, and we're gonna encourage our friends and family to be scientifically literate. Say yay.
All right. Go ahead.
Okay, I think I'm definitely optimistic, but I think we also have great room for improvement. As you remember, I said earlier that U.S. adults are doing well, but it's still only about 30% of the population could be considered scientifically literate, and so there are things that we can improve in schools and in out-of-school programs, non-formal, informal education. And the fact that the social scientists are studying this phenomenon, figuring out ways to reach people who, for whatever reason, scientific values are not their values. And so I'm optimistic we'll figure out how to even reach those populations.
Even though I've been a physicist only for the last 26 years, when I started teaching, there was lots of new science programs for the high school. And they were all really concentrated not on just memorizing, but on trying to think through things. They usually had a whole bunch of letters and stuff. But one of them that I remember that I really liked, although I thought the program was a little shaky, but I loved their math, their lab program. The very first lab of the year was instructions, just like we can all remember, do this, what the purpose of this lab is to do that and stuff. And throughout the year, the instructions got less and less and less, and the final lab of the year was a blank page.
Oh dear.
And, I think that this idea of science as being a process rather than just a memorization has been coming for some time, but education never happens all of a sudden. It's got an enormous inertia, and it takes a long time to change. But I think it does change gradually.
I'm leaning toward pessimism. I would like to see it go towards optimism, but my main worry is the filters that, like Leslie said, that people are using may not be appropriate, because when we have so much information available, then people may tend to glean on to what they hope the outcome will be, not based upon the real data, but again, because I can go out there, I can find something to support it. And because of that, without getting into politics, I'm just very concerned that unless we have the correct filters, even though we may think that we're literate, that we may be using that to advance agendas that are more politically driven. I'm old and crotchety.
Well, let me attack this from a little more cultural side. On the web, on the NASA website, they were announcing the new Europa mission, which is under construction now. They're not actually cutting metal yet, but they're in final prep for doing so. And somebody made the comment, best idea since the Cassini mission, good job NASA. But then someone else made this comment, why only 10,000 views on this video? I see this video from Russia. Americans, you do not understand what you have and what great country you live in. This came from Russia, okay? I think we have a great deal to be optimistic about. There's tremendous potential for every person in this room to be a communicator, to help people understand the way science really works. Think globally, act locally, I think is one thing we can all do. And I think it's great to see all the interest here. Thank you for your patience with us since we didn't have a moderator, and for all the great questions.
I think we did.
Yeah.